Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's edition of the Geeking Out podcast. I'm the Athletic Geek, and this is a very special episode that I'm very excited about. Uh, the gentleman who has joined me today is named Kevin Hunsperger. He was a local news anchor here in the Southern Illinois area, but more than that, he is has lived out the ultimate wrestling fan fantasy. He has gone from just being a fan to having his own podcast and talk show like we have here to eventually becoming a color commentator, and then finally the ultimate dream was realized. He was able to step between the ropes and have a match in a professional wrestling ring, and not just that, but have it in front of quite a few number of people, and probably one of the best atmospheres to this day that I've been through in wrestling. It's I still consider that show where he had his first professional wrestling match to be up there with All In and the Royal Rumble and WrestleMania as far as the most exciting events I've ever been part of. Kevin, thank you for agreeing to do this show.
Well, thank you very much for having me. I appreciate it.
So my first question, it's kind of the standard question, is when did you get into wrestling? What began your fandom for professional wrestling?
Well, when I was a kid, I grew up in St. Louis, and when I was a kid, wrestling was a huge part of St. Louis. The WWF, the NWA, and of course, wrestling at the Chase were all staples and coming through the area quite often. And my younger brother and my dad and my uncle were big time fans, and this is back in the late '70s with like Harley Race and Dick the Bruiser and King Kong Bruiser Brody. Those were like the guys that they always talked about, and I never really got into it. And then it was late 1982, flipping the channels, and I came across Kerry Von Erich versus Ric Flair in the steel cage.
Oh
And it was the
wow!
night that the Freebird feud erupted with the Von Erichs, and after that, I was hooked. And so it was really my dad and my brother who were watching it all the time, and I finally, started paying attention. And from there, it just went crazy, and I started buying the magazines, and we would go to the matches not every time, but uh, many times when they would come through town, whether it was the NWA or WWF, and we would go to shows with friends and other family members, and it just became kind of a bonding experience, a guy's night out, usually happening on Friday nights, and it just was a really good time to be a wrestling fan.
So you mentioned Flair and Von Erich were your kind of your go-to's, and but you saw a
Mm-hmm.
little bit of everything. Was there,
Sure.
as the wrestling boom in the 1980s progressed, did you kind of have a loyalty to the NWA or to World Class or to the WWF, or were you kind of like a connoisseur of everything? Or
I was a connoisseur of everything. Growing up, like I said, in St. Louis, we had access to all the companies you just mentioned. Also, Mid South, the AWA was on TV, and then a company called Central States, which was out of the Kansas City area, I believe. So we had access to all of that. So on Saturdays and Sundays, wrestling was on in the mornings. It was on at night. So just got to watch a lot of it. I always kind of label myself though as once World Class kind of started to go down a little bit, I became a WWF loyalist in terms of if I had to choose, if NWA was on and WWF were on at the same time, because back then you didn't have a remote to flip the channels with. You had to physically get up and click the TV itself. So I would definitely stick with WWF and then kind of keep up with NWA stuff in the magazines or, through family and friends that would kind of post me up on stuff too.
who were your favorite wrestlers growing through this time, or just through growing up through everything else?
As a kid, Kerry Von Erich was like a god to me. He was the modern day warrior. He was this ripped, buff guy that just kind of he was just a god among men. And he was one of those guys. Like I said, it was that match that first kind of got my attention. Hulk Hogan, of course, I was a Hulkamaniac when I was younger, and then kind of outgrew that. But Randy Savage, Rowdy Piper, um, the standard guys, I think that a lot of people kind of gravitate to. And then as I got older, Ric Flair. Ric Flair is my all-time favorite, just because the speaking powers and the in-ring work, and just his loyalty to the business, and just what he gave of himself, night after night. It was an honor to be there the night that he lost to Shawn Michaels at WrestleMania 24, and then we were live in the crowd that next night at Monday Night Raw when they did the retirement ceremony. So, and I know he came back and wrestled again after that, but at that time, and I
We
still
don't
look
talk
back on
about
that.
that.
Yeah, I still look back on that as one of my favorite memories as a wrestling fan, for something that I was actually there live and participating in.
So you ended up, as you grow up, you begin. Was it you? I first became familiar with you through WSIL
Hmm.
TV3 here in the Southern Illinois area. Was that always a goal of yours throughout your adolescence? It was to pursue a job in that, or was that kind of something you fell into? Take me through what led you to becoming a news anchor.
Well, it is kind of something that I fell into, actually, believe it or not. And I know that's really not a career that a lot of people just kind of quote unquote fall into. But when I went away to college, I went to Southeast Missouri State University in Cape Girardeau, which isn't far from Southern Illinois. And back then I was there in the early '90s, and there was no television broadcasting curriculum. There was no broadcast news curriculum there. They do have programs now, but back then it wasn't there, and I didn't know what I wanted to do. I knew I wanted to get involved in mass media and mass communication in some way, whether it's through public relations or radio. I took some video, some like videography classes. So I learned all of the basics that you needed, and then it was just kind of getting your foot in the door. Which with a lot of careers, that's just the way it is. But luckily, I stayed persistent when I moved back to St. Louis after college, and I got my start behind the scenes working at the CBS affiliate up there, KMOV.
Oh, okay.
Some of the reporters took me under their wing and showed me the ropes. And for TV jobs, back then, even now still, but they're not on tape anymore. It's all YouTube and digital. But back then, I had to create a VHS tape of some work, and so you do that. You shop it around the country. You send them off. And I got hired in a little town called Florence, Alabama, and that's where I started my career. And bounced from there to Indiana, and then moved to Southern Illinois in 2004. And fortunately for me, at the time, was hired as the morning news anchor. And we were building a family at the time, and didn't want to leave the area. So 15 years later, I stuck around for 15 years, and then kind of switched gears and took a job in the world of marketing now.
Okay. From uh, from your job at WSIL, I remember you know through a mutual friend of ours becoming familiar with the fact that you were a wrestling fan, and
Hmm.
one of my first times meeting you and your co-host on your show in person was in 2011 at a TNA event at Rent One Park in Marion, Illinois.
Okay, yeah.
So from there, I became familiar with your blog, my 123 cents, and everything else from there. What gave you, because that was in 2011? I mean, other than like maybe Wrestling Observer Live and Wrestle Crap Radio, and maybe Colt Cabana had just kind of started. Wrestling podcasting wasn't really what it is today. There wasn't the plethora of everybody, doing it, including me, who just has a computer and a microphone. Uh, what,
Right.
how did you come up with the idea for that? Before that kind of became the cool thing for wrestling fans to do.
Well, it was. I've always liked to write, and I had a blog um, that I just kind of wrote about different things going on in pop culture or happening in my life. And a friend of mine who was very big into blogging at the time, and this was in 2010. So this fall will mark 10 years of the blog and the YouTube channel. But he was very much into blogging, and he actually sent me a Facebook message one night and said, "You know what? You are so passionate about wrestling. You should write about it. You should do a blog." And so I thought about it, and I always I knew that I was never going to have like the inside scoop or the news that was going on. So I didn't want to have a news blog, but I was going to write about my experiences, my opinions, my thoughts. And instead of just saying it's my 2 cents, I tweaked the phrase and did my 1, 2, 3 cents, like the referee counts to three. And that's where it all that's where the name came from, was that. And then shortly after that, my co-anchor at the time uh, is still today very big on YouTube. And so I had talked to her, and she encouraged me to start doing YouTube videos. So, September of 2010, the blog started. December of 2010, the YouTube channel started. And then I was procuring some interviews. Hacksaw Jim Duggan had come into town. D'Lo Brown was here for that baseball event that you were talking about. So I was able to use the blog and the podcast as kind of obviously my career in journalism as a insider step, so to speak, that maybe some others wouldn't have been able to do, because of the TV job kind of gave me a little more credibility, I think, and that's what helped me get those interviews and build a presence on the YouTube channel. And then it wasn't until I always wanted to do a podcast, but I didn't know how to get started. And then that's when in 2014 I was invited by Greg Mahachko to join the Jittery Monkey podcasting network, which is where every Monday since December of 2014, a new episode of the podcast has dropped. So it's just, it's one of those things that just takes some time, and you have to kind of be persistent more than anything. And, some weeks I hit gold, I think, with a guest, and some weeks it kind of fizzles out. But, because like you said, everybody is doing podcasts these days, and it does make for a competitive space, but I think that it's fun. And if you're having fun doing it, I say keep going.
Absolutely. That was pretty much. I feel like I'm just my ideas are mirroring yours quite a bit as I'm learning through this conversation, because I just randomly started a Facebook. This whole thing started with me just out of a Facebook page, because people on my actual Facebook account was like, I get tired of hearing you talk about wrestling and comic
Mm.
books. And I'm like, okay, well, I'm going to start a Facebook page for it. And then it just kind of grew. And it started with an old girlfriend of mine listen to me and my friends talk about this stuff and go, all those people you watch on YouTube, you sound just like them. So it's just, it's interesting. You mentioned you got some interviews with, the likes of D'Lo Brown, Hacksaw Jim Duggan. That kind of segues into my next question. What do you have any interesting stories through those particular interviews? Not just those, but like any other ones you may have had. They can be they can be friendly. They can be not so friendly. You don't have to mention names, But do you have any fun stories of your times
You know,
interviewing them?
everyone that I have been fortunate enough to interview, some in person and a lot over the phone, have been really good. Nothing stands out as being bad.
That's good.
Mickie James was a very interesting one, because she had come to a small town in Saline County here in southern Illinois. They had just experienced some flooding, and they were doing a wrestling show as a fundraiser. And I knew the promoter, and I contacted him, and I told him, I asked if she would be available for an interview. And at that time my wife was working evenings, so I took my, gosh, I think she was probably about 5 or 6 years old at the time, daughter with me. And she was just enamored, and Mickie was so sweet and so nice. And we went inside. The show was being held outside, and she's like, let's go inside, it's quieter, and we can do the interview. And she sat down, and like you, I'm on a shoestring budget myself. I mean, I use my iPhone to record the video, and it's definitely my most watched video on my YouTube channel. And it was just, very nice, very sweet of her to do that. But probably, actually, if my friend Chad listens to this interview, he's going to roll his eyes because I almost forgot about it until just now. But um, and I guess we'll probably talk in depth about it in a little bit too. Was AAPW with main event? Two of the wrestlers that came in that night were Pac and El Generico, and they had a match. And we got to hang out with those guys backstage. It was Colt Cabana, Pac, Generico, and Matt Cross. They were super cool guys, and nice guys. They said goodbye. We left. Yada yada yada. And I think we're never gonna, see these guys or talk to these guys again. Well, fast forward about a year. No, I'm sorry. It was about 3 months later. We were at WrestleMania in Miami, and there was a pro. I think it was Pro Wrestling Guerrilla. Maybe they were. It was one of the indie shows that happens WrestleMania weekend, and Pac was wrestling. And I happened to walk past him after the show, and he recognized me. And so we talked for a minute, and then that would have been 2012. So then in 2014, we were at WrestleMania Access in New Orleans, and we stood in line and did the signing with, it was Rusev, Lana, Bailey, and Neville now, who was Pac.
Mm-hmm.
And he recognized me again. This is, like I said, this is 2 years later, and I had said, "Hey, my name's Kevin. I don't know if you remember me, but AAPW." And he's like, "Oh yeah, man." And so, whether or not he really did, I was like, "Okay." Well, then in 2016, we go to Dallas for WrestleMania, and Chad decides to surprise me, and he goes, "I'm taking you out for a surprise," because I became a big fan of Neville's after all this, and I felt like, hey, we're friends, but knowing that we're really not friends. But anyway, Chad, we pull up at Toys R Us, and I'm like, "What's going on?" And he goes, "Neville is doing a signing here," and so we stand in line for probably about an hour. We finally get to the front of the line, and I'm not kidding. Neville says to me, "Kevin, what's going on, man?" Like, he actually even remembered my name. And
That's
Chad was
awesome.
like, he rolled his eye because I always made a big deal about and it's kind of a running joke between us, but that's probably one of the coolest experiences, just because it's like, here's a WWE superstar who remember and knows me by name. So that was fun. But anytime I've had a chance, I've always been grateful to meet and talk with the superstars, the legends, whether it was for my job with the news or doing stuff with them independently and putting it on the podcast.
It's not to steal any of your thunder because that's an awesome story. It reminds me of All In Weekend. And I might have told this story on my All In episode of this. So if you're one of the 10 people that religiously follow me, I'm sorry for for reiterating the story. But Matt Cross was on the show and he was doing the Starcast convention, and I went up and met Matt Cross, and I bought a one of his hats from him that I've actually, it says "Wrestling is Forever," and I've worn it
Oh
to
yeah.
All In and every AEW event I've gone to since then. But the first thing I wanted to ask him, I said, was, "Do you remember wrestling in Marion, Illinois in January of 2012?" And I'm thinking he might go like, "Oh, well, or something." But actually said like, "Oh yeah, I very much remember that show because I remember, Pac and Cabana and Generico all, tried to get me on the show and even said they were willing to take less money if I could get on the show. So yeah, I very much remember that." And he like knew exactly what I was talking about, and I'm like, "Whoa, that's really cool that he remembered that." But
Yeah. Well, and another funny story from that show, and this is what I like about independent wrestling, because the wrestlers and the talent take time to talk, and I'm not saying, implying anything negative about the other companies, because obviously it's a much different environment. You have a couple of hundred fans or a few dozen fans compared to thousands of fans, typically speaking. So, but that night at main event, we took a group picture, and El Generico, I think people know, but I'm not going to ruin the illusion for anyone. Anyway, a friend of mine who works in Orlando now, was doing an interview WrestleMania weekend when WrestleMania was there last year, year before last, and he got to interview El Generico, and he was at that show as well at main event. The reporter photographer guy was, and he mentioned that show, and Generico responded with, I still have the picture of us with that group of guys that promoted the show hanging up in my house. So there's a picture of me hanging up in El Generico's house right now. So I just, again, it's so insane, and it's such a small world, but it's very cool, very very cool.
So we're mentioning, we're really talking about main event. We're going to get there
Sure.
shortly, but before main event began, there was All American Pro Wrestling in Southern Illinois,
Mm-hmm.
and I mentioned on the Livewire McGuire interview, I first heard about it at the SIU Arena WWE house show with just people coming up handing out flyers, and Livewire was one of them. Uh, I don't go to the AAPW show that they were handing out the flyers for. I go to a much smaller one that, for all intents and purposes, was not a good show because they couldn't use the top rope, but I was still enamored with the people there. And then I become a loyal fan. Don't think I don't think I missed very many shows at all uh, from '07 to 2009, maybe like one or
Mm-hmm.
two. What got you interested in this wrestling promotion that was running in the Southern Illinois area?
Well, I mentioned my buddy Chad, who used to live here and work at WSIL as well, and he was really one of the first people I met here and discovered was a wrestling fan. And I didn't, the other areas that I worked, I didn't have a whole lot of friends who were wrestling fans. So um, meeting Chad was really cool, and he was into the indie scene, and we were able to go to a couple of the AAPW shows back. This would have been like probably it was in the early days of AAPW before the TV or anything like that.
Right.
So then, as the years went by, um, I kind of casually knew Chris Hagstrom, who became the executive producer of All American Pro Wrestling, but he was working over at SIU and teaching TV production students, and he had decided to make a project. The final project for his students was to produce a wrestling show. And so he had messaged me and asked if I would be interested in um, being the color commentator. He was going to do play by play, and he wanted me to do color commentary. And I was absolutely flattered. Well, it turned out, though, that the show that they were taping was happening over WrestleMania weekend, the year that it was in Atlanta, and I'd already had tickets and was going to be in Atlanta. So when I got back, we sat in his apartment and watched the show and did commentary then that way, and did it kind of post production style. He put it together as kind of a pilot of sorts, and actually, independent of me, took it to WSIL and presented it, and wanted to get it on the air, and was able to secure a slot on Saturday mornings. And for a time, we were producing. I believe it was on a every other week schedule on TV, and then supplemental weeks there was a YouTube show that kind of supplemented what was happening on TV. So it just kind of grew from there, and it was my connection to having a job in the TV business, and obviously people knew I was a wrestling fan because of that, and then that's where Chris and I met, and things developed from there. So I was again another right place, right time moment for me.
Other than everything that led into AAPW main event, what are some of your favorite stories of working on the show, be it live or like I said, it can be fun stories. You don't have to mention any names if you feel it's a touchy story. But what are some good stories from AAPW during that time period?
Well, the first thing I want to do is kind of shatter an illusion that some fans may have, because the wrestling business is obviously it's not like any other business that I've ever been involved with. AAPW in particular, we were doing shows at Black Diamond Harley Davidson in Marion. That kind of became our home base. But because we didn't, we were not there as far as being able to store everything and whatnot. So we would show up usually early on a Saturday morning, like between 7 and 8 o'clock. We would set up the arena, for lack of a better word. Unfortunately, though, not everybody wants to be helpful. And with AAPW, a lot of the talent was from out of town. So they weren't coming in until right before showtime. So it was a very small handful of people every month that was setting up. Then we'd do the shows, and we usually recorded 2 or 3 different episodes, and then sticking around to tear everything down, take it back to the storage unit. It was usually midnight or 1 o'clock in the morning before it was all said and done, and we were sitting down and having dinner at Steak and Shake. That was our kind of post show celebration spot, was Steak and Shake, because it was about the only place that was open. So, from that perspective of it, and I did it though weekend or month after month because I loved it and I had a passion for it, and so we wanted to see it grow and succeed. So that's kind of the ugly underbelly of it, but again, it was something that when you enjoy what you're doing, it's not such a bad thing. Because I had never set up a wrestling ring before. I had no idea what was involved in that whole process, but it was something that I appreciate the opportunities and being able to make a lot of great friends that are my friends to this day. Heath Hatton, who is with Stride Pro Wrestling now, but he was a guy I met with AAPW, and over this past weekend, I married him and his wife. In a wedding ceremony. So it's built some lasting friendships and relationships that I'm more than happy to have been a part of. So, but yeah, those taping days were always fun because you got to bounce ideas off of the guys and kind of tell them the direction that we're going, and being behind the scenes, and then doing some of the stuff with the talent on camera. They were always fun moments, and great memories that I still have. And we're almost 10 years removed now from when the TV side of AEPW started.
You've mentioned bouncing ideas. Was there any ideas or suggestions that they took for the TV show that were yours, or ones that you added to, or anything that sticks out?
One thing I will kind of stake my claim to is we were looking for ways to kind of add a little personality to some of the characters that we had, because obviously wrestling is big into characters. And one thing I had pitched, and I actually found my notebook the other day with all of my notes and ideas in it. And one of the things that I had pitched was a segment called Old School. And it's kind of like a Piper's Pit segment where Gaylord Stevens, who was, this old school manager guy who is magnificent on the microphone. And so the idea was that he would do this interview segment and bring guys out. And most of the time he was, it was like Roddy Piper with Piper's Pit back in the days. He's putting down the good guys and chumming it up with the bad guys. And so that's kind of what we did. And so that was my, I guess, claim to fame, if you will, with AAPW. But a lot of it was, it was a lot of collaborative group efforts, and but then also sometimes you get too many cooks in the kitchen and you spoil the broth. So I was aware enough to know when to kind of keep my head down and my mouth shut, and when to speak up, and what hills were worth dying on. And so but yeah, again, all fun experiences, and there were some tumultuous times, but that's like that with any kind of business you get into, I think.
So now I feel like we got to talk about your very first professional wrestling match against Mike Masters at AAPW main event. Like I said, to this day, and I'm not trying to overrate the event. It is a personal choice because of everything that I've seen happen with AAPW, from church gyms that had no shower and smelled like urine, um, to seeing that many people coming out for an AAPW show, seeing people like Pac, who, other than Dragon Gate USA, Evolve, and PWG, at the time did not wrestle American Indies for anybody
Hmm.
else being able to come
Yeah.
in. Um, Colt Cabana, who I had been begging and begging and begging the promoter to bring in since he got his release from the WWE. Um, because of the personal connection, I put it right up there with the aforementioned All In, WrestleMania 35, the only WrestleMania I've ever been to, the Royal Rumble 2012, the G1 Supercard at Madison Square Garden, all of that I still consider AAPW to be one of the most magical nights in wrestling. And for the people in this area, you were a large part of what made that event successful with the storyline that you were involved in with one of the top bad guys in All American Pro Wrestling, Mike Masters. Take us through the idea behind that storyline, and for a lot of the folks that unfortunately, are not familiar with All American Pro Wrestling, if you can, kind of take us through the narrative of the story bit by bit, so maybe they can understand why a news anchor made this event one of the most important events in the company's history.
Well, thank you. And yes, it still holds a very special place in my heart as well. And it all started in April of 2011 with Chris Hagstrom coming on to the morning newscast, because we used to do interview spots. And he was coming in to promote the fact that they were going to be doing this TV taping at the SIU ballroom, I believe is where they did the very
Yes.
first show from. And so Chris had contacted me that morning or the day before and had said, "What do you think about Mike Masters coming out and interrupting?" And it was going to be Heath Hatton and Chris Hagstrom were going to be the two talkers, because Heath Hatton they were building up. Heath is local, and they were, Edmund, I believe, was living in Cape at the time, so it was easier to bring Heath in to do the interview that early in the morning. So they had asked Masters to come in and interrupt it and bring a chair and hit Heath with it, and then I was going to make the save and hit Mike Masters with this chair. And there's, I was hesitant because I wasn't sure, because again, it was my job, and I'm like, I don't know how my bosses are going to react to this, but I also lived by the philosophy of it was better to ask for forgiveness than permission. So we went ahead and we did it, and we did the segment, and that was just it. It was, it was Masters comes in, cuts us off at the end. He goes after Hatton, hits him, and then picks up a chair and is going to hit him with the chair. And of course, he's, got his back to me. I pull the chair out of his hands and whack him in the back with it. And then Hatton throws him off the set. And I thought that was going to be it. Well, later, then Chris approaches me and says, "What do you think about having a match with Masters?" And I, as much as I was a wrestling fan as a kid and as an adult, I knew that I had limitations athletically, and I was never going to be able to get in the ring and have a match. And I kind of scoffed at the idea. And he's like, it would only be a couple minutes and you wouldn't take any bumps. And he's kind of laying it out like what the idea is and how we're going to build to it in January. So this is like May or June. So we got like a 6-7 month build going on. And I didn't want to do it because of the Michael Cole, Jerry Lawler stuff, and I just never really got into announcers and wrestlers mixing it up. But when Chris explained it to me, and the booker at the time had called me, and they said, and this is, I'm going to sound self-serving in this, and I don't by any means mean to sound this way, but because I was a local news anchor, I was a local celebrity at the time, and they really wanted I don't want to say to cash in on that, but they wanted to kind of exploit that and use that to help promote the brand of AAPW and get it off the ground running, especially since it was on the station that I was anchoring on. So when it was kind of put into those terms, I agreed, and we were off to the races. And so we would do TV tapings, and we were dropping little hints at the beginning of, Masters has heat with me, and he's yelling at me about things that I have no control. He's thinking that, and then he goes on a losing streak, and he's blaming it on me because of the chair shot from TV, and he can't focus and he can't concentrate because I'm there and I'm bothering him, and so it just kind of builds up to where we get to a couple weeks before the big show, and he keeps challenging me, and I keep saying I'm not wrestling you, and finally Jay Spade comes out to interrupt, and Master says, I'll wrestle you, Jay Spade, and if you beat me, then I'll leave Kevin alone forever. But if I beat you, he has to wrestle me. And so I agree to this stipulation. Masters, of course, cheats and wins. And so now the match is set. And so it was so, I was nervous as hell. I didn't know what to expect. I was 39 years old at the time. And I'm like, I do not belong in a wrestling ring at this age. I have no experience. But we went through it, and, only being a couple minutes turned into like almost 15, and but it was so much fun, and it was it was an opportunity that I'm so grateful for. And Mike Masters was magnificent, and made sure that we were both safe throughout the whole course of the match. So
that was your perspective of that match, but that whole event, with how special it is, what was going through your head starting out at the commentary desk?
yeah.
And you're seeing this, for those that are not from the area, the taping, he mentioned as Black Diamond Harley Davidson. They have this big warehouse, and it's played host to mixed martial arts events, concerts, and whatnot. It's this big warehouse that they can kind of turn into an arena, and there's enough seating there that you can sit. They have like floor seats and then a little bit for an upper deck, and then like Harley Davidsons all
Right.
over the top of it. And there, I don't remember the exact figure. I mean, you might know that more than me of how many people showed up, but there was people from everywhere that came down to little old Marion, Illinois for this show. There were people that were driving from Indiana, the St. Louis area, Kentucky. Some made the trip down from Chicago. Just so many people who, and those people were out of town because they're like Pac and Generico in, not in Japan or not in California. Let's get all over this. But for every one person there, every person that came from out of state or out of town for it, there was another one that was excited to see the person that they wake up to every morning in a wrestling match. So, what could be going through your head with all these people where you first got to sit down and do commentary, and then at some point in time, you got to leave and prepare for your first ever pro wrestling match?
Yeah, and that was the crazy part, because again, we got there early that Saturday morning. We got everything set up. We were doing this for a DVD taping, so we knew we were still going to have the production. It wasn't going to be on TV, but we knew that it was going to be produced and distributed because of the international talent that we were having on the show. Um, I don't know exactly how many chairs we had set up, but I remember being backstage and someone from Black Diamond coming in and saying, "We need more chairs." And Pac stood up and he gave his chair, and that was really cool to me as well, because you have some people in the wrestling business have an inflated ego or an inflated sense of self, and they don't, all those guys gave up their seats, they handed them off, and it was a few more chairs to throw out to the crowd. I believe the final figure was 405 people
Wow.
that were there, which, in some people may be listening and thinking, well, that's not that much, but
You don't.
at
They don't
that
understand
time,
where
yeah,
AAPW was. You didn't
we
grow
were
with this
drawing
company.
75, maybe 100 sometimes. There were shows that you might have had 24 people in the crowd. So to get that number was amazing. And I remember going out to sit down for commentary because I did commentary for the first half of the show, and then we had an intermission, and then I was Mike and I were second to last match, and so they wanted me to do commentary for the first half. I remember sitting down and I looked up, and across on the risers part where the motorcycles were also being stored, they were letting fans go up there and sit or stand because it became standing room only. And I looked up, and three of my fraternity brothers from college from the 90s were standing there, and they're waving, and they came from St. Louis, so they drove all the way from St. Louis to watch this. And so that was really special to me as well. And just my coworkers coming out, and my so many people coming out and supporting the cause. And I remember not telling my family, because my wife and kids came as well, and I didn't tell them what was going to happen. But it was just surreal and very, very cool. And unfortunately, Masters did take a chair shot at the end, and the chair wasn't exactly right, and it got him right on the top of the head, and he actually ended up getting 6 staples in his head as a result. But that notwithstanding, it was just the perfect night, and just
Absolutely, it was.
so awesome. And I'm glad that you were there, and you can kind of help me articulate the environment and the crowd and just how hot and wild it was that
Oh,
night.
absolutely. It was, to me, this was, because like you mentioned, there were so many AAPW shows where, I mean, and it was a small company, small promotion, a local police officer, promoted it just out of his own love of old school wrestling and to give, some guys in the area opportunities. And I've gone to shows, and I'm not knocking any of these cities, so please don't, if you're listening, please do not take this the wrong way. But whenever you go to Royalton, Illinois, and you keep driving where there's literally nothing there, and the building they're wrestling in, you've driven by it 3 times because you don't know that that's a
Right,
building that has wrestling. And while West Frankfort was like their home base, when you go to that New Beginnings Assembly Hall, and when you walk in, you immediately get the nasty smell of stale popcorn and urine. And sometimes there's, like I said, maybe a good 50, 75 people there, and the guys all working hard. And then sometimes it's like, I better not talk too loud because I might, I might
right.
interrupt the match. And then when you actually see, yeah, there's going to be some people listening to this going, 405 people. I'm from Chicago, and that's Tuesday for my local indie, and that's great. That God bless them for that. But you really, speaking as a fan, like that was kind of like your reward of not. I'm not trying to sound like the douchey hipster, but that was kind of my like. I was liking this before it was, but before you all came, I was at the Nasty Church gym
Yeah.
watching these guys go out. Before you know El Generico and Pac came here, I was more so getting excited for Livewire McGuire and Shane Rich and Mike Masters, or booing Mike Masters and whatnot. Just depending on what it was. And I'm gonna, I have the Livewire McGuire episode, and I don't really want to feel bad saying this now because I have yet to talk to Edmund. He's coming back, and we're going to talk about main event.
Oh,
But
cool.
the one thing I remember talking to Edmund after the show, or talking to Edmund at intermission, excuse me. And that was right after Pac and
Hmm.
Generico finished their match, and he just looked at me and went, "How am I going to follow that?" And I remember, just really with his match against Axe Allward in the main event. I remember the first thing I wanted to say was, "You followed it,"
Yeah.
because while they may not have had the athleticism in that match, they told a story like no other, to where for every near fall, my heart was up in my throat because I didn't want Livewire to lose the title on the biggest show. Um, and it was just an amazing experience. It's like you know I could do a whole episode just talking about this evening with friends and
Hmm.
all you guys. There was a lot
Yeah.
of there was turmoil in my home life. Not like with my mom being injured, and you know I'm barely scraping by enough money. I'm working two jobs, and I have just barely enough to be able to go there and you know buy a hot dog there. But I'm so glad that I made it, and it was just kind of it was AAPW finally reaching heights that I always felt it was worthy of making, but I didn't know if it was ever going to make it there.
Right. Yeah.
And then couple in the fact that I'm in kind of a very very stressful and scary part of my home life, it was just like, well, I have this, and this was good, and all the things that were bad going on, this is good. So it was a magical night.
Yeah.
It was very
It
special.
it was, and hearing that from a fan's perspective as well. I mean, it makes it all worth uh, everything that went on. Leading up to that, and building up, and getting you know everybody in place, and I'm glad that you were there, and that you were able to kind of uh, get that escape from reality, so to speak, and have some fun for a couple of hours, and watch, and make connections, like you were able to have Edmund on the show, and talk with him, and I'm flattered that you invited me to be a guest as well.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate you coming on here. We got a little bit of time left. So I do want to touch on this. You are now actually wrestling regularly.
Semi regularly, yeah. So obviously AAPW kind of faded away, and in 2013, Pro Wrestling Collision was kind of the rise from the phoenix of AAPW, so to speak. Well, then that wasn't long for the world by any means, and was gone by. It started in January and was gone by May of 13. So there was a little respite of sorts. And in 2016, my friend Heath Hatton, as I mentioned, came to me with the idea that he was going to start Stride Pro Wrestling, and asked me if I would be the ring announcer for it. And I agreed. And then, along the way, uh, a lot of the guys were like, "Oh, I want to wrestle Hunsperger. I want Kevin to wrestle again." And I'm like, "I'm not wrestling again. There's no story here. There's no reason for me to wrestle." And Heath, or his real name Tyler, said to me, well, would you wrestle again? And I said, well, yeah, if it's the right opportunity, I would certainly do it. And we were actually going to go, the original plan. And I don't know if I've talked much about this or not, but the original plan was they were turning Farmer Billy Hills bad, and he had shoved me one night at a show, and that was this planting of the seeds for was going to be me against Farmer Billy Hills. Well, then Farmer got injured and wasn't able to, and he was out for quite a bit, and they weren't sure when he was going to be able to make it back and wrestle again. So Tyler shifted gears, and we went with Roger Mathis, who is a near 300-pound uh, guy with mixed martial arts experience, and he is the ultimate badass. And we told a really good story with that, and I was really proud of what we did. And we actually wrestled in a steel cage. Well, then that was in 2018, and then almost a year went by, and he's like, "We're going to do this again, but we're going to do it as a tag team, and we're going to win the tag team titles." And I was like, because I always think that the guys that are getting in there with me don't want to, because one, I have no experience, and two, they're putting over a 40-something-year-old former news anchor. But everybody has been really cool about it, and we've had fun doing it. And so I step in. We won the tag team titles last summer, held on to him till October, and then after we dropped him, I kind of went back to announcing. Well, then he needed me in a pinch for another show at Black Diamond last December, and so we did a
The,
6-man tag.
the AAPW
Yeah,
reunion
yeah, it was
show.
the AAPW reunion show, and so we did a 6-man tag at that, and
That that
then
that was another. We could do a whole nother episode on that. That was
yeah,
a that was a real, because I remember mentioning to this. All right, I'm picking up more names, but talking to Livewire, I remember mentioning like I was so happy that show happened just because mentioning the high highs of main event, and then like and the momentum being kept up throughout 2012, and then just all of a sudden,
Right.
poof,
And
it's
that was,
gone.
yeah. And I think that show, we were able to get, or Tyler really was able to get a lot of the former guys who wanted to come back and who wanted to wrestle again. And there were a couple of other names that were signed on to do it, but had, someone got sick at the last minute and someone else had a family situation going on, so they weren't able to make it. So there were a few other names from AAPW that were supposed to be there, but couldn't. But I think that show gave a lot of the talent who was a part of AAPW, and then as it went away, it gave them a little bit of closure because AAPW never really had that swan song or that send off. It just kind of ended.
Yes.
So the show with Stride and AAPW together, I think, was good for all of us, and the
Me as a
fans. I
fan,
think,
oh yeah.
yeah, I think the fans. It really meant a lot to the fans as well to see that, and who knows, we may do. Once this pandemic and everything is over and we're able to have real shows with fans in the crowd and whatnot again, it may be another opportunity to do that again.
Absolutely, I agree with you. The closure was like it was really, you know, like I said, everything was taken away so suddenly. Whenever like AAPW was really like, I'm guilty of this, and I kind of mentioned this on the Livewire episode where I always enjoyed AAPW, but like I always got a little bit more from the fandom perspective excited for some of the indies we'd follow out of St. Louis. And that's not a
Mm-hmm.
slide on AAPW. It was just kind of like AAPW's like, I'm going to see Edmund. I'm going to see these cool guys I like. We're going to get a fast food meal and I'll be home in 45 minutes. Whereas like it felt like an adventure going to St. Louis, and they have Claudio Castagnoli and Tyler Black booked, and Mike Quackenbush is booked, or all these quote unquote big name indie guys, and we're gonna eat at IHOP. There's no IHOPs around at that time. There wasn't an IHOP close by, so like it
Right.
felt like an adventure. Whereas AAPW was just kind of like that fun thing we'll drive 30 minutes to go see. But in 2012, AAPW was just as exciting as those shows in O'Fallon and Alton and St. Louis that we were going to, because of just the atmosphere, the production, everything just was so high. And and as fans that had been there from the days of, like you said, a couple dozen people in the crowd in a nowhere town in Southern Illinois, like you felt like you built it up, and then just all of a sudden, boom, it's gone, and you're like, well, that's sad. And then
Yeah.
we finally got to see something that meant a lot to you know a lot of us as fans, and I'm sure quite a few to everybody that worked on it.
Sure.
Finally got to see it go away, and it meant a lot to get to be part of that, and the the lights fantastic parade made me late, but I was there for the Star Spangled Banner and stood the whole time, and I was
Oh,
okay with
nice.
it.
Awesome.
um,
That's awesome.
so we're almost out of time, but if you feel comfortable doing some word association, would you be willing to do that?
Absolutely. Sure.
Okay, well I've name dropped him a lot, but Livewire McGuire.
Mr. Electricity.
All right, Mike Masters.
Oh, I'm trying to think of something nice to say, but Bully.
All right, Jay Spade.
Heart of a champion.
Keith Hatton.
An amazing friend and someone who has given a lot of people a new opportunity here in Southern Illinois to pursue the dream of wrestling.
Chris Hagstrom.
A generous, caring guy who probably cared too much, and that's where things kind of went south, I think, a little bit for AAPW.
Well, I got to come up with one more because I want to end on a more positive note. Oh, jeez. Shaun Chambers.
Shaun Chambers. Oh wow, Shaun is another one of those guys. Just a great heart and someone um, who got it. And I appreciated and respected him for kind of being that force behind the early days of AAPW, and what a guy he is too.
Well, that's a much better way, a much more positive way of ending it. But that's really cool to hear about Hagstrom. But I think we're gonna put a bow on this one. If there's more opportunities to talk some wrestling or get involved in some more projects, so would you be willing to come back?
Absolutely, I appreciate this opportunity tonight.
All right. You want to plug any social media or anything you're working on right now?
If you want to check out my 123 cents on Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, Twitter, that's the best place to find me. Or just look under my name as well, Kevin Hunsperger, and send me a request or send me a follow or a like or whatever, and we'll connect.
All right. And that is it for this week's episode. Thank you all for watching this. If you enjoyed this, please give it a like, share, subscribe for more content, not just from pro wrestling, but from the world of anime, gaming, comic books, and all things geek culture. Go follow me on my social media pages at facebook.com/athleticgeek89, Twitter at athletic_geek89, and on Instagram at athleticgeek89. But once again, thanks to Mr. Kevin Huntsberger for agreeing to do the show. I've had a lot of fun and really enjoyed getting to reminisce about some magical times. And thank you for taking time out from me. I know you're a busy man.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it.
Thank you, everyone, for watching. Have a good one.